Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from? And what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between, I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. In the scorching badlands of New Mexico, where ancient mysteries lie buried beneath layers of dust and time, one man's greatest loss was about to become his most extraordinary destiny. What happens when the bloodline of Pharaoh's war horses, hidden for over 1,000 years, emerges from the desert to choose a broken cowboy as their guardian? What happens when corporate greed collides with sacred bloodlines that predate the pyramids themselves? This is the story of how ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs burned into living flesh would transform a foreclosed rancher into the keeper of secrets that pharaohs died to protect, and how sometimes the most impossible things choose us when we've lost everything else. The New Mexico sun beat down on Samuel Carter's shoulders like the judgment of an unforgiving god, each ray seeming to seek out the threadbare patches in his worn flannel shirt. At 67, Sam's body bore the accumulated weight of 5 decades spent wrestling with the unforgiving land. Shoulders permanently curved from lifting hay bales, hands gnarled from gripping reins and rope, face carved into deep lines by wind and weather, and the relentless passage of disappointment. He stood in what had once been the heart of the Carter homestead, surrounded by the skeletal remains of buildings that had sheltered 4 generations of his family. The main house, where his great-grandfather had raised 12 children, was nothing but a foundation of charred stones and twisted metal. The barn where Sam had learned to rope and ride had been reduced to a pile of blackened timber that still smoldered 3 days after the mysterious fire. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd missed his final mortgage payment by exactly 3 days when the fire started. 3 days. After 43 years of payments, 43 years of fighting drought and disease and market crashes that wiped out entire herds, he'd fallen short by 72 hours and lost everything. Sam's hands trembled as he picked up a piece of charred wood that had once been part of his father's workbench. Not from age. His body was still strong despite the years, but from a rage so pure and concentrated that it threatened to consume him from the inside out. This hadn't been an accident. Lightning didn't strike with such surgical precision, leaving the expensive surveying equipment untouched while destroying every building that mattered. "Still here, old-timer?" The voice cut through the desert silence like a rusty blade, carrying with it the particular brand of cruelty that money bought and conscience couldn't afford. Jake Morrison stepped out from behind one of the expensive SUVs that had brought the corporate survey team, his designer boots crunching on the debris of Sam's life. At 28, Morrison represented everything Sam had learned to despise about the New West. A city boy dressed up in ranch clothes that cost more than most men made in a month, playing cowboy while actual cowboys lost their homes to his employer's greed. His perfectly pressed jeans had never seen honest dirt, and his spotless hat had never shaded a man's face during 16-hour days in the saddle. Behind Morrison came the other 2 members of the survey team, Rebecca Chen, a cold-eyed woman in her 30s who treated human displacement like a mathematical equation, and Marcus Webb, a thick-set man who took visible pleasure in other people's misery. They carried tablets and measuring devices worth more than Sam's entire remaining worldly possessions. "Foreclosure was final yesterday," Chen announced, consulting her tablet with the detached efficiency of someone who'd delivered this news countless times before. "You're trespassing on Meridian Development property now." Sam felt his jaw clench until his teeth ached. Meridian Development, the corporate vultures who'd been circling the valley for 3 years, buying up distressed properties and turning working ranches into luxury resorts for city folks who wanted to play cowboy on weekends. "This land's been in my family since 1882, Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of generations. "My great-grandfather built that house with his own hands." And now it's going to be a spa, Webb laughed, the sound ugly in the desert air. Rich folks from Phoenix and Dallas paying $2,000 a night to ride horses and pretend they're pioneers. Progress, old man. The three surveyors spread out across Sam's property with the casual confidence of conquerors, their expensive equipment beeping and clicking as they reduced his family's legacy to digital measurements. Sam watched Chen photograph the burned remains of his barn, probably for insurance purposes, while Morrison set up some kind of GPS device where Sam's father had proposed to his mother 60 years ago. "You know what I love about these old places?" Morrison called out, his voice dripping with false nostalgia. "So much character, so much history. Really adds to the authentic Western experience we're creating." Sam's hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white beneath sun-spotted skin. He thought about his son Marcus, who would have been 32 now, who'd planned to take over the ranch after college. Marcus, who died because Sam had chosen pride over medical attention, insisting he could tough out what turned out to be a massive heart attack until it was too late to save anyone. "Of course, the guests won't want to see actual poverty," Webb added, consulting his tablet. "We'll have to tear down that old bunkhouse, too. Replace it with something more picturesque." The bunkhouse where Sam's grandfather had lived for 15 years after the arthritis made riding impossible, where 3 generations of Carter men had learned to read the sky for weather, to understand the land's moods and seasons, where Sam had spent his last nights with Elena before the cancer took her, talking about the future they'd never see together. Above them, vultures circled in the crystalline blue sky, their shadows passing over the ruins like dark omens. Sam wondered if they sensed the death of something more than buildings, the death of a way of life that had sustained his family for over a century. "Speaking of picturesque," Chen said, lowering her camera, "we're going to need you gone by sunset. Security team arrives tomorrow to make sure the property stays clear." Security team. Hired guns with badges and authority, men who'd never worked an honest day but had the law on their side. Sam had seen it happen to the Hendersons 2 valleys over, and the Rodriguezes before that. Fight back, and you'd find yourself in jail. Submit, and you'd find yourself homeless. The desert air shimmered with heat waves that turned the distant mountains into liquid mirages, and Sam felt sweat trickling down his spine despite the dry climate. The 3 surveyors continued their methodical destruction of his family's memory, measuring and photographing every corner of the homestead as if cataloging artifacts from a dead civilization. "You know what's funny?" Morrison said, leaning against the fence post where Sam had carved his and Elena's initials 45 years ago. "My boss was worried you might cause trouble. File appeals, get lawyers involved, make noise with the local press. But look at you. Just standing there like a scarecrow, watching your whole world disappear." The words hit Sam like physical blows, each one designed to strip away another layer of dignity. He thought about the foreclosure proceedings, how he'd sat in that courtroom in his only good suit, while lawyers in $1,000 outfits discussed his property like it was nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Chen finished photographing the well that Sam's great-grandfather had dug by hand, the same well that had never run dry even during the worst droughts. "Emotional attachment is just another form of inefficiency," she said, her voice clinical. "The land doesn't care who owned it. It just produces whatever value the market demands." Webb laughed at something on his tablet screen. "Says here this place was assessed at $800,000 last year. We picked it up for $60,000 at auction. That's what I call a bargain. $800,000. More money than Sam could imagine, more than his family had ever dreamed of having. But to these people, it was just another line item, another acquisition in their endless hunger for profit." Sam felt something breaking inside his chest, some final restraint that had been holding back 5 years of accumulated grief and rage. He took a step toward Morrison, his weathered hands forming fists, but then stopped as he caught sight of movement on the horizon. Through the heat haze, something was approaching from the east, moving with a strange, dreamlike quality that made Sam question whether the stress and heat were affecting his vision. At first, it looked like another mirage, a dark shape wavering through the superheated air that rose from the baked earth. But as it drew closer, Sam realized he was looking at something impossible, something that belonged in museums or ancient paintings rather than the modern American Southwest. A horse was approaching across the desert, but not any horse Sam had ever seen in 5 decades of ranch work. This animal moved with a fluidity that seemed to defy the laws of physics, its hooves barely touching the ground as it covered the distance between the far ridge and Sam's property. Even from a quarter-mile away, Sam could see that it was magnificent, coal-black from nose to tail, standing nearly 17 hands high, with a build that spoke of speed and power in perfect balance. But there was something else, something that made Sam's breath catch in his throat. The horse's movement wasn't just graceful, it was purposeful. It wasn't wandering or grazing or fleeing from something. It was heading directly for the Carter homestead with the focused determination of a guided missile. "What the hell is that?" Morrison squinted into the distance, shading his eyes with one manicured hand. The horse continued its approach, and now Sam could make out details that defied explanation. Its coat gleamed like polished obsidian, despite the dust and heat of the desert crossing. Its mane flowed like black silk, longer and more luxurious than any wild horse should possess. But most striking of all were its eyes. Even at this distance, Sam could see they held an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Probably just some rancher's stray," Webb said dismissively. "These desert horses go feral all the time. Animal control will deal with it." But Sam knew horses, had been working with them since he was old enough to walk. And this wasn't any rancher's stray. This animal moved with the confidence of something that had never known captivity. Never felt the bit or the rope. Yet there was nothing wild or unpredictable about its approach. It carried itself with the dignity of royalty, as if it owned not just the desert, but the very air it breathed. Chen raised her camera, focusing on the approaching animal. "Might make a nice shot for the marketing materials. Wild horses on the range, that sort of thing." The horse was close enough now that Sam could hear its hoofbeats. Not the irregular pattern of an animal picking its way carefully across rough ground, but the steady, rhythmic cadence of a creature that knew exactly where it was going and why. The magnificent stallion covered the final 100 yards at a measured trot, and Sam found himself transfixed by the animal's bearing. This wasn't just a horse. It was a living work of art. A creature so perfectly formed that it seemed to have stepped out of ancient legends rather than emerged from the harsh reality of the New Mexico desert. As it drew closer, more impossible details became visible. The horse's coat wasn't just black. It held depths of color that shifted from coal to midnight blue to deep purple, depending on how the light struck it. Its conformation was unlike anything Sam had ever seen, with a slightly dished face that spoke of Arabian bloodlines and a powerful chest that suggested strength beyond measure. But there was something wrong. The horse's gait, while still graceful, carried a subtle unevenness that spoke of exhaustion or injury. Foam flecked the corners of its mouth, and Sam could see the telltale signs of dehydration in the animal's slightly sunken eyes. "Look at the size of that thing," Morrison breathed, momentarily forgetting his role as corporate intimidator. "Must be worth a fortune." The horse approached to within 50 feet of the group before stumbling slightly, its perfect composure cracking for just an instant. Sam saw the animal's sides heaving with labored breathing, saw the way its head had begun to droop despite its obvious efforts to maintain dignity. This magnificent creature was dying. Without conscious thought, Sam took a step forward, his rancher's instincts overriding everything else. He'd seen enough animals in distress to recognize the signs. This horse was beyond exhaustion, running on pure willpower and nothing else. the stallion's amber eyes fixed on Sam's face, and in that moment of connection, something passed between man and animal that transcended species barriers. Sam felt a jolt of recognition, as if he were looking into the eyes of something that understood loss, displacement, and the weight of carrying burdens too heavy for any single creature to bear. Then the horse took another step forward and collapsed. The great stallion's legs simply gave out, sending him crashing to the desert floor with a sound like thunder. Dust billowed up from the impact, and the animal lay on its side, flanks heaving with desperate attempts to draw breath into lungs that had been pushed beyond their limits. "Well, that solves that problem," Webb said, pulling out his phone with casual indifference. "I'll call animal control. They can haul the carcass away before it starts to smell." The callousness in his voice hit Sam like a physical blow. Here was a creature of obvious magnificence, possibly dying, and these people saw it as nothing more than an inconvenience to be disposed of. Their reaction crystallized everything Sam despised about the corporate mentality that was devouring the West. The inability to see value in anything that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. "Might want to call it in as a hazard," Chen added, snapping photos of the fallen horse with the same clinical detachment she'd shown for the burned buildings. "Insurance company will want documentation that we handled it properly." Morrison was already dialing, his phone pressed to his ear as he walked a few steps away from the group. Sam could hear fragments of his conversation. "Big horse. Looks expensive. Probably diseased. Need removal ASAP. The stallion lifted its massive head slightly at the sound of human voices, its amber eyes seeking out Sam's face with desperate intensity. There was intelligence in that gaze, a plea for help that transcended the barriers between species. This wasn't just an animal seeking assistance, it was a sentient being asking for compassion from another sentient being. Sam found himself taking another step forward, then another. His practical mind told him to stay back, that a dying horse could be dangerous in its death throes, that he had enough problems without getting involved with someone else's livestock. But something deeper than practical considerations was driving him now, some recognition of kinship that he couldn't explain or ignore. "I wouldn't get too close," Webb called out. "Thing might have rabies or something. These desert horses carry all kinds of diseases." But Sam continued his approach, his eyes never leaving the stallion's face. As he drew closer, more details became visible that defied explanation. The horse's tack was unlike anything he'd ever seen, a halter made of leather so soft and supple it looked like it had been crafted by master artisans, decorated with what appeared to be silver inlays that caught the desert sun and threw it back in brilliant flashes. And there was something else. Something that made Sam's blood run cold with recognition and impossibility. Sam knelt in the dust beside the fallen stallion, close enough now to see details that made his world tilt on its axis. Along the horse's muscular shoulder, barely visible beneath the midnight black coat, were markings that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist in any rational universe. They were brands, but not the simple letters and numbers that American ranchers use to mark their livestock. These were symbols of breathtaking complexity and artistry, burned into the horse's hide with precision that spoke of ancient craftsmanship. Hieroglyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, as clear and detailed as if they'd been carved in stone rather than seared into living flesh. Sam's hands shook as he traced the air above the markings, afraid to touch them, afraid they might disappear like mirages if subjected to physical contact. But there was no mistaking what he was seeing. The sacred eye of Horus, the Ankh symbol of eternal life, and others that stirred memories he'd tried to bury for 40 years. His grandfather's voice echoed across the decades. "Samuel, these symbols are older than Christ himself. They represent power that pharaohs died to possess, mysteries that were ancient when Rome was still a village of mud huts." Professor Jeremiah Carter had been the black sheep of the family, an archaeologist who'd spent his inheritance chasing legends across Egypt and North Africa while his brothers built the ranch into a thriving operation. Sam's father had always spoken of Jeremiah with a mixture of love and exasperation, calling him brilliant but impractical, a man who valued knowledge over common sense. But Sam remembered the stories his grandfather told during winter evenings, tales of hidden chambers beneath the pyramids and bloodlines that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. Stories about horses bred specifically for pharaohs, animals so prized that their genealogies were recorded alongside those of kings. Most of all, Sam remembered the tattoo that had covered his grandfather's left forearm, the same symbols that were now staring up at him from the shoulder of an impossible horse in the middle of the New Mexico desert. Impossible, Sam whispered, the word barely audible above the stallion's labored breathing. But the evidence was right there in front of him, burned into flesh that was real and warm and dying. The stallion's amber eyes found Sam's face again, and in their depths he saw something that shattered the last of his rational resistance to what he was witnessing. Intelligence, yes, but more than that. Recognition. The horse was looking at him not as a stranger, but as someone it had been seeking, someone it had traveled impossible distances to find. Sam's mind raced back to his grandfather's journals, leather-bound volumes filled with cramped handwriting and detailed sketches that his father had dismissed as the fantasies of an old man obsessed with ancient history. After Jeremiah's death, the journals had been stored in the attic of the ranch house, gathering dust while more practical concerns demanded attention. But Sam had read them as a boy, fascinated by tales of expeditions into the Valley of the Kings and secret chambers that contained treasures beyond imagination. His grandfather had written extensively about the horses of the pharaohs, describing bloodlines that had been preserved through centuries of conquest and upheaval by dedicated guardians who understood their sacred significance. The horses of Rameses the Great were not mere animals, one passage had read. They were living symbols of divine authority, bred from stock that traced its lineage back to the horses of the sun god Ra himself. Their bloodlines were more carefully guarded than those of princes, for the pharaohs understood that true power flowed not from human ambition, but from connection to forces beyond mortal comprehension. At the time, Sam had dismissed such claims as the romantic exaggerations of an old man who'd spent too much time in the desert sun. Horses were horses, useful for work and transportation, but hardly divine. Now, looking into the eyes of this magnificent stallion, he began to understand that his grandfather might have been describing literal truth rather than poetic metaphor. The horse struggled to lift its head again, the effort obviously costly but determined. Its gaze never left Sam's face, and he had the unsettling sensation that the animal was trying to communicate something specific, something urgent that transcended the barriers of language and species. Behind him, Morrison finished his phone call and approached with the swagger of someone who'd just solved an annoying problem. Animal control will be here in an hour. They'll tranquilize it and haul it away. Probably end up as dog food, but that's not our problem. The casual cruelty in Morrison's voice ignited something primal in Sam's chest, a protective fury that he hadn't felt since the night his son died. Here was a creature of obvious magnificence, possibly the last of an ancient bloodline that had served pharaohs and witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and these corporate parasites saw it as nothing more than an inconvenience to be disposed of. "No," Sam said, the word emerging with quiet authority that surprised even him. Morrison paused mid-stride, his eyebrows raising in amused disbelief. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Sam placed his hand gently on the stallion's neck, feeling the warmth of life that still pulsed beneath the magnificent coat. "You're not calling animal control. You're not having this horse destroyed." Chen looked up from her tablet with the expression of someone observing an interesting but ultimately irrelevant phenomenon. "Mr. Carter, this is no longer your property. You have no authority here." But Sam wasn't listening to legal technicalities anymore. The horse's breathing was growing more labored by the minute, and he could see that without immediate help, this magnificent creature would die in the dust of his ruined homestead. The symbolism wasn't lost on him, two broken beings stripped of everything they'd once possessed, finding each other in the moment when all seemed lost. "This horse didn't choose to collapse on Meridian Development property," Sam said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "It chose to come here, to my family's land. That means something." Webb laughed, the sound harsh in the desert air. "It means you've been alone too long, old man. It's just a horse. Probably sick, definitely worthless. Let the professionals handle it." But as Webb spoke, the stallion managed to lift its great head once more, fixing its amber gaze not on Sam, but on the three corporate intruders. The intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable, and so was the disdain. This was a creature that had served kings, and it recognized peasants when it saw them. The effect was immediate and startling. Morrison took an involuntary step backward, his corporate confidence cracking in the face of something he couldn't categorize or control. Chen's tablet slipped slightly in her hands, and Webb's laughter died in his throat. For just a moment, the balance of power in the clearing shifted. Three humans with legal authority and modern technology found themselves judged by an animal that carried itself with the dignity of nobility, and somehow, impossibly, they were found wanting. "Get away from that animal," Morrison said, but his voice carried none of its earlier confidence. The stallion's gaze had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, and Sam could see uncertainty creeping into his corporate demeanor. Sam ignored the command, instead moving closer to the horse's massive head. Up close, the hieroglyphic brands were even more detailed and precise, not crude marks burned by ranch hands, but intricate symbols that would have taken master craftsmen hours to complete. The Eye of Horus seemed to watch him with living intelligence, while the Ankh symbols pulsed with significance he was only beginning to understand. "You know what I think?" Sam said, his voice carrying across the desert air with new authority. "I think this horse didn't just happen to collapse here. I think it came looking for something. Someone." "That's ridiculous," Chen snapped, but Sam noticed she hadn't moved any closer to the animal. None of them had. Despite their legal authority and modern sensibilities, they all sensed that they were in the presence of something beyond their understanding. The stallion's breathing grew more labored, and Sam knew that time was running out. Whatever had driven this magnificent creature across the desert to find him, it was spending its last reserves of strength in the effort. The thought of such majesty ending as roadkill because of corporate indifference filled him with a rage that burned hotter than the desert sun. "My grandfather used to tell stories," Sam continued, his hand resting gently on the horse's neck, "about bloodlines that were preserved across centuries, guardians who understood that some things are worth more than money." Morrison's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and he glanced at the screen before answering. "Yeah, they're here. No, just some old coot who won't leave. What do you mean, delay?" Sam caught fragments of the conversation, something about permits and environmental surveys, bureaucratic delays that might postpone the development project. A small smile played across his weathered features as he realized that even corporate efficiency could be slowed by red tape and government oversight. "Looks like your timeline just got complicated," Sam observed as Morrison ended the call with obvious frustration. "Temporary setback," Morrison snarled. "Doesn't change anything. That horse is still getting removed, and you're still trespassing." But Sam could see the uncertainty in all three faces now. Their perfect plan was encountering obstacles they hadn't anticipated, and the presence of this impossible horse seemed to be a catalyst for complications they couldn't control or predict. The stallion's amber eyes suddenly flickered with renewed intensity, as if responding to some stimulus beyond human perception. its great head lifted with visible effort, nostrils flaring as it tested the desert air. Sam felt the animal's muscles tense beneath his hand, and for a moment he wondered if the horse was gathering strength for one final effort. Then he heard it, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, distant but unmistakable. Hoof beats, multiple horses approaching from the west, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than leisure. The sound grew stronger by the moment, accompanied by something else that made Sam's blood run cold with recognition. Singing. Human voices raised in what sounded like Arabic or some other Middle Eastern language, chanting words that carried the rhythm of ancient prayers or battle hymns. "What the hell is that?" Webb demanded, his earlier confidence evaporating as he scanned the horizon for signs of the approaching riders. The stallion's response was immediate and dramatic. Despite its obvious weakness, the great horse managed to struggle to its feet, swaying slightly but standing with renewed determination. Its amber eyes blazed with an inner fire that spoke of bloodlines awakening to their true purpose, and Sam felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the transformation. This wasn't just a horse anymore. It was a war mount, a creature bred for battle and glory, responding to the call of its people after years of exile and separation. Through the heat haze, shapes began to resolve on the western horizon. Riders approached in a loose formation, their mounts moving with the fluid grace of animals bred for desert travel. Even at distance, Sam could see that these weren't casual horsemen. They rode with the precision and purpose of a military unit, their movements synchronized in ways that spoke of long training and shared purpose. Chen fumbled with her phone, her earlier clinical detachment replaced by obvious alarm. "Should I call the sheriff? These people might be illegals or terrorists or something." But Sam was remembering more of his grandfather's stories, tales of secretive groups who had spent centuries preserving bloodlines and guarding secrets that predated Christianity itself. The Hashemite Preservation Society, Jeremiah had called them, descendants of ancient Egyptian nobility who had scattered across the world after the Arab conquest, carrying with them the genetic treasures of the pharaohs. "I don't think they're here to cause trouble," Sam said quietly. "I think they're here for him." He gestured toward the stallion, who was now standing at full height, despite its obvious exhaustion. The horse's entire bearing had changed. Where moments before it had been a dying animal seeking help, it now stood like a king receiving homage from loyal subjects. The riders emerged from the desert heat, like figures from an ancient tapestry, their approach accompanied by the rhythmic chanting that seemed to make the very air vibrate with power. 6 mounted figures led by a 7th who rode slightly ahead, all of them moving with the fluid precision of people who had been born to the saddle. As they drew closer, details became visible that confirmed Sam's growing understanding of what he was witnessing. These weren't ordinary horsemen. They were guardians of something precious, protectors of secrets that most of the world had forgotten. Their mounts were magnificent animals that shared obvious bloodline characteristics with the collapsed stallion, and their riders wore clothing that blended modern practicality with ancient traditions. The lead rider was a man of perhaps 55, his bearing suggesting authority earned through decades of responsibility rather than corporate appointment. He rode a gray stallion that moved like liquid mercury, and even from a distance, Sam could see the intelligence in his dark eyes as he assessed the situation in the clearing. Morrison backed toward his SUV, his phone pressed to his ear as he tried to explain the developing situation to his supervisors. "I don't know who they are. Yes, they look foreign. No, I don't think they're here for the development." The corporate surveyor's obvious fear would have been amusing under other circumstances, but Sam was too focused on the approaching riders to take pleasure in Morrison's discomfort. Something momentous was happening, something that would change everything that followed, and he sensed that his next words and actions would determine not just his own fate, but the future of secrets that had been guarded for over a millennium. The lead rider raised his hand, and the entire group came to a halt 50 yards from the clearing. For a moment, absolute silence fell over the desert. No wind, no insect sounds, even the omnipresent hum of the surveyor's equipment seemed to fade into insignificance. Then the man spoke, his voice carrying easily across the distance, despite its conversational tone. "I am Khalil al-Rashid, keeper of the bloodlines, guardian of the ancient ways. We have come for Malik al-Sara, the king of the desert, who bears the mark of Rameses the Great." His English was precise and formal, spoken with the slight accent of someone who had learned the language perfectly but hadn't been born to it. More importantly, his gaze was fixed not on the corporate intruders, but on Sam, as if recognizing something in the old rancher that the others couldn't see. The stallion, Malik al-Sara, lifted his magnificent head at the sound of his name, and Sam felt a jolt of recognition that went deeper than conscious thought. This wasn't just a horse with Egyptian markings. This was a specific animal with a specific history, sought by people who had spent years tracking his movements across the American Southwest. Khalil dismounted with fluid grace, his movements suggesting a man comfortable with both physical action and diplomatic negotiation. He approached the group in the clearing with measured steps, his dark eyes taking in every detail, the burned buildings, the expensive surveying equipment, the obvious tension between Sam and the corporate representatives. But it was the stallion that commanded most of his attention. Khalil's gaze traveled over the horse's magnificent form with the expertise of someone who could read bloodlines like genetic textbooks, noting details that would be invisible to untrained eyes. "Magnificent," he murmured, speaking to himself in what sounded like Arabic before switching back to English. "The bloodline runs true after all these years. He is indeed the descendant of the war mounts that carried Rameses into battle at Kadesh." Morrison found his voice, though it carried none of its earlier arrogance. "Look, I don't know who you people are, but this is private property. You're trespassing, and that horse is going to be removed by animal control." Khalil's gaze shifted to Morrison with the kind of attention a lion might give to a particularly noisy insect. "This animal carries genetic material that has been preserved for over 3,000 years. He represents a bloodline more valuable than your entire corporate enterprise. You speak of removal as if he were common livestock." The quiet authority in Khalil's voice made Morrison's bluster sound like the yapping of a small dog. Here was a man who commanded respect through presence rather than position, whose confidence came from knowledge and purpose rather than legal documents and corporate backing. "I don't care if he's descended from Pegasus himself," Webb interjected, trying to reclaim some measure of control. "It's just a horse and it's interfering with our schedule." The 6 other riders had remained mounted, but Sam noticed their hands resting easily near what appeared to be weapons concealed beneath their traditional robes. These weren't academics or horse enthusiasts. They were guardians who had spent their lives protecting something precious, and they were prepared to use force if diplomacy failed. Khalil turned his attention to Sam, and their eyes met with an intensity that seemed to bridge cultures and centuries. "You are the one who has been caring for him," the guardian said. It wasn't a question. Sam nodded, suddenly aware that he was participating in something much larger than a property dispute or even a horse rescue. The symbols burned into the stallion's shoulder, his grandfather's stories, the arrival of these mysterious guardians, all of it was connected in ways he was only beginning to understand. "My grandfather would have known what this means," Sam said quietly. "Professor Jeremiah Carter. He spent years in Egypt, studying the old ways." The effect of those words on Khalil was immediate and dramatic. The guardian's formal composure cracked slightly, replaced by something that looked like recognition and perhaps even hope. "Jeremiah Carter," Khalil repeated slowly. "The archaeologist who saved the bloodlines during the revolution of 1952. We have been seeking his descendants for 70 years. Sam felt the ground shift beneath his feet as the full implications of Khalil's words sank in. His grandfather hadn't just been an eccentric archaeologist chasing legends in the Egyptian desert. He had been part of something real, something vital, something that had shaped the course of history in ways the family had never understood. "The bloodlines," Sam repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "He really saved them." Khalil nodded gravely, his dark eyes never leaving Sam's face. When Nasser came to power, many of the old estates were seized, their treasures scattered or destroyed. Your grandfather worked with our society to smuggle 12 horses out of Egypt, animals whose genealogies stretched back to the stables of the pharaohs themselves. The stallion, Malik, stirred at their conversation, his amber eyes moving between Sam and Khalil, as if following the discussion with intelligent interest. Despite his obvious exhaustion, the great horse maintained his regal bearing, standing like a living monument to bloodlines that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. "We lost track of the animals after they reached America," Khalil continued. "Your grandfather promised to preserve them until our society could establish itself in the New World, but then he died, and we could find no trace of his family or the horses." Sam's mind raced through memories of his grandfather's final years, the old man's increasing withdrawal from family life, his obsessive attention to certain horses that he kept separate from the ranch's working stock. At the time, Sam's father had attributed Jeremiah's behavior to advancing age and academic eccentricity. Now, Sam realized his grandfather had been fulfilling a sacred trust that the family had never understood. "The horses," Sam said, pieces of a 70-year-old puzzle finally falling into place. "The ones he kept in the north pasture, he said they were too valuable for ranch work." Khalil's eyes blazed with sudden intensity. There were others, more than just this one? But before Sam could answer, Morrison stepped forward with renewed aggression, apparently deciding that diplomacy had gone on long enough. "I don't care about your ancient horse stories. This is American soil, subject to American law, and I'm calling the sheriff." The corporate surveyor's phone was already pressed to his ear, but Khalil's next words stopped him mid-dial. "Mr. Morrison, I suggest you reconsider. The horses you are so eager to dispose of are protected under the International Treaty for the Preservation of Cultural Heritage. Harming them would constitute a federal crime with international implications." Morrison's face went pale as the legal ramifications began to sink in. Chen fumbled with her tablet, obviously searching for information about international heritage laws, while Webb looked like a man who was beginning to realize he was in over his head. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and amber that seemed to make the entire scene glow with otherworldly beauty. In this light, the stallion's midnight coat took on depths of color that defied description, while the hieroglyphic brands seemed to pulse with their own inner fire. Sam found himself thinking about the weight of responsibility that his grandfather had carried for all those years, the knowledge that he was preserving something irreplaceable, something that connected the modern world to the glory of ancient Egypt. No wonder Jeremiah had become increasingly reclusive in his final years, burdened by secrets he couldn't share and trusts he couldn't abandon. "If there are others," Khalil said urgently, "we must find them. The bloodlines are too precious to remain scattered and unprotected." Sam tried to remember what had happened to his grandfather's special horses after the old man's death. His father had been focused on maintaining the ranch's viability, viewing Jeremiah's exotic animals as expensive luxuries the family couldn't afford. Some had been sold, others traded, a few given away to neighbors who appreciated fine horse flesh without understanding its true significance. "They were dispersed," Sam admitted, feeling the weight of 70 years of lost opportunities. "My father didn't understand their value. He thought grandfather was just being sentimental about pretty horses." The pain that crossed Khalil's features was almost physical in its intensity. 70 years of searching, and we may have lost them forever. But the stallion chose that moment to intervene in their conversation, lifting his great head and releasing a call that seemed to come from the depths of his chest. Not quite a whinny, not quite a roar, but something that carried across the desert like a trumpet, announcing the presence of royalty. The effect was immediate and startling. From somewhere in the distance came an answering call, then another and another. Within moments, the desert air was filled with the voices of horses responding to their king's summons. Morrison dropped his phone, his face going white as the implications of what they were hearing sank in. There are more of them out there. Chen's tablet slipped from nerveless fingers as she stared toward the horizons where dust clouds were beginning to appear. Not just one or two horses, but what looked like entire herds responding to the stallion's call. Webb backed toward the SUVs, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "We need to leave. Now." But Khalil was smiling for the first time since his arrival, his weathered features transformed by an expression of joy and wonder. "They remember," he breathed. "After all these years, they remember their king." The horses came from every direction, north, south, east, and west, moving with the purposeful determination of animals answering an ancient summons that transcended ordinary equine behavior. Sam watched in amazement as the desert itself seemed to come alive with the thunder of hoofbeats and the flash of magnificent forms appearing through the heat haze. These weren't the usual Mustangs or ranch horses that roamed the Southwest. Every animal that approached shared certain unmistakable characteristics. The refined heads and arched necks of Arabian breeding, the powerful builds that spoke of carefully maintained bloodlines, and most tellingly, the distinctive markings that identified them as descendants of the horses his grandfather had preserved. A beautiful gray mare arrived first, her coat shimmering like silver in the desert light. Behind her came a bay stallion whose proud carriage and intelligent eyes marked him as nobility, followed by a chestnut filly whose delicate features and flowing movement spoke of bloodlines refined across millennia. Within an hour, nearly 24 horses had gathered in the clearing around Sam's ruined homestead, forming a living tableau that seemed to bridge the gap between ancient legend and modern reality. They arranged themselves in a loose circle around Malik, their king, maintaining the respectful distance that wild horses showed to their herd leaders. Morrison and his team had long since retreated to their vehicles, obviously overwhelmed by developments they couldn't understand or control. They made phone calls and consulted tablets and argued among themselves, but their corporate authority seemed laughably insignificant in the face of forces that operated according to laws older than civilization itself. Khalil moved among the horses with reverent attention, examining each animal with the expertise of someone who could read genetic history in the curve of a neck or the set of an eye. His assistants dismounted and began documenting the gathering with cameras and notebooks, recording details that would help them verify bloodlines and plan for the preservation efforts that lay ahead. "It's impossible," Chen muttered from the safety of her SUV. "Horses don't behave like this. They don't respond to calls across miles of desert." But Sam was beginning to understand that the word impossible had lost much of its meaning over the past few hours. These weren't ordinary horses governed by ordinary instincts. They were the living legacy of pharaohs, carriers of genetic material that had been shaped by human ambition and divine aspiration for over 3,000 years. "My grandfather knew," Sam said, speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "He knew they would remember when the time came." Khalil approached him with eyes that blazed with something beyond mere excitement. "Mr. Carter, what we are witnessing here changes everything, not just for our preservation efforts, but for our understanding of what these bloodlines truly represent." As the sun continued its descent toward the western peaks, casting the assembled horses in light that seemed to gild their coats with actual gold, Khalil approached Sam with an expression of grave formality. The Guardian's assistants had completed their initial documentation, and the corporate surveyors had withdrawn to a safe distance, obviously recognizing that they were witnessing something beyond their ability to influence or control. "Samuel Carter," Khalil said, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. "Your grandfather was granted guardianship of these bloodlines because he proved himself worthy through knowledge, courage, and sacrifice. The responsibility he accepted was not his alone. It was meant to be passed to those who came after him." Sam felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he was strong enough to bear. All around him, magnificent horses stood in silent witness to whatever was about to unfold, their presence a reminder that some responsibilities transcended personal comfort or convenience. "I'm not my grandfather," Sam said quietly. "I'm just a broken-down rancher who lost everything that mattered to him." Khalil's smile was gentle but unwavering. Loss is often the beginning of wisdom, not its end. These horses chose to come here to your land in response to their king's call. That suggests they recognize something in you that you may not yet see in yourself. The stallion, Malik, stirred at their conversation, lifting his magnificent head to study Sam with those ancient amber eyes. Despite his earlier collapse, the great horse now radiated strength and authority, as if the presence of his scattered family had restored something essential to his nature. "There is a test," Khalil continued, his tone becoming more formal. "A trial that has been used for centuries to determine worthiness for guardianship of the royal bloodlines. It requires no violence, no contest of strength or speed. Instead, it tests the qualities that truly matter: understanding, patience, and the ability to earn trust rather than demand obedience." Sam looked around at the assembled horses, each one a living treasure whose value couldn't be measured in monetary terms. They had survived centuries of upheaval, war, and displacement, preserving bloodlines that connected the modern world to the glory of ancient Egypt. The thought that he might be worthy of such a responsibility seemed absurd, but the alternative, watching these magnificent creatures disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of animal control, was unacceptable. "What does the test require?" Sam asked. Khalil gestured toward Malik, who had struggled to his feet and now stood with regal bearing despite his obvious exhaustion. "You must demonstrate the 7 sacred bonds that exist between true partners, horse and human united in purpose rather than domination. No halter, no rope, no force of any kind. Only trust, understanding, and the recognition that real leadership serves rather than commands." The desert air grew still as Khalil began to explain the ancient trial that would determine Sam's worthiness to inherit his grandfather's sacred responsibility. The assembled horses seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Their attention focused on the human drama unfolding in their midst, with intelligence that transcended ordinary animal awareness. "The first bond is trust," Khalil said, his voice taking on the cadence of ritual instruction. "The horse must approach you freely, without coercion or inducement. True partnership begins with choice, not compulsion." Sam stepped away from the group, moving to the center of the clearing where Malik could see him clearly. The great stallion studied him for a long moment, amber eyes seeming to peer into the depths of his soul. Then, with movements that spoke of royal dignity despite his exhaustion, the horse began to walk toward Sam. Each step was deliberate, purposeful, a choice made in full awareness of its significance. When Malik reached Sam, he lowered his magnificent head until their foreheads nearly touched, a gesture of acceptance that made the watching guardians nod with approval. "The second bond is respect," Khalil continued. "You must show submission to the horse's wisdom, acknowledging that true leaders understand when to follow." This was harder for Sam, requiring him to overcome a lifetime of human assumptions about dominance and control. But as he looked into Malik's ancient eyes, he began to understand that the stallion carried knowledge accumulated across generations of breeding and selection. Sam knelt in the dust, bowing his head in recognition of wisdom that predated his own understanding. Malik touched his muzzle to Sam's shoulder, a gesture that spoke of acceptance and perhaps even affection. "The third bond is understanding," Khalil said. "Communication without words, recognition of needs and intentions that transcend the barriers of species." Sam rose slowly, his attention focused entirely on the stallion's subtle communications, the tilt of his ears, the position of his head, the way his weight shifted from foot to foot. Gradually, Sam began to sense what the great horse needed, not just water and food, but connection, purpose, the satisfaction of serving something greater than individual survival. Moving carefully, Sam led Malik to the well that his great-grandfather had dug by hand, drawing up cool water in the same bucket that had served the Carter family for 4 generations. The stallion drank deeply, his trust in Sam now complete and absolute. The remaining bonds, strength, wisdom, courage, and unity, would test both man and horse in ways that would determine not just Sam's worthiness, but his understanding of what it truly meant to be a guardian of living legends. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold that seemed to set the very air on fire, Sam and Malik prepared for the final test that would determine their partnership. The other horses had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the clearing, their presence creating a natural amphitheater for the ancient trial. The corporate surveyors watched from their vehicles, obviously recognizing that they were witnessing something that would change everything about their development plans. Morrison's phone rang constantly with calls from superiors demanding explanations he couldn't provide, while Chen documented everything with the resigned efficiency of someone who knew her reports would sound like fantasy to anyone who hadn't been there. But Sam was no longer thinking about property disputes or corporate greed. The trials had awakened something in him that he'd thought died with his family, a sense of purpose that transcended personal loss, a connection to something larger and more enduring than individual grief. The final bond, unity, required Sam to mount Malik without saddle or bridle, to move with the stallion as if they were a single entity rather than separate beings. It was the ultimate test of trust and understanding, requiring both partners to surrender individual control in service of shared purpose. Malik knelt in the dust, allowing Sam to swing onto his back with movements that felt both foreign and familiar. As the great horse rose to his feet, Sam felt a moment of vertigo, not just from the height, but from the sensation of connecting with power and wisdom that stretched back across millennia. Then Malik began to move, and Sam understood why pharaohs had treasured these bloodlines above all other possessions. The stallion's gait was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Smooth as silk, yet powerful as thunder, covering ground with effortless grace that made the desert floor seem to flow beneath them like water. They moved as one across the darkening landscape, horse and rider united in perfect harmony, while the assembled horses followed in formation that spoke of ancient ceremonies and royal processions. In that moment, Sam finally understood what his grandfather had been protecting. Not just genetic material or historical artifacts, but a living connection to humanity's dreams of transcendence. When they returned to the clearing, Khalil was smiling with tears streaming down his weathered face. "The bloodlines have chosen their guardian," he announced. "May they flourish under your protection as they did under your grandfather's care." As the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Sam Carter, broken rancher, grieving father, homeless wanderer, became something he'd never imagined possible. The keeper of Pharaoh's dreams, guardian of bloodlines that had witnessed the birth of civilization itself. The corporate vultures could keep their development plans. Some legacies were worth more than money, and some responsibilities were too sacred to abandon. In the gathering darkness, 24 horses of royal blood stood guard around a ruined homestead that had become the most important place in the world, a sanctuary where ancient wisdom would be preserved for future generations who might still dream of glory and transcendence. But this is only the beginning. How will Sam protect these priceless bloodlines from corporate forces that won't give up easily? What other secrets did his grandfather hide across the American Southwest? And what happens when the modern world collides with ancient responsibilities that demand everything a man has to give? The answers wait in the chapters to come, where a cowboy's education in guardianship has only just begun, and where the bonds between man and horse will be tested by forces that would destroy anything standing between them and profit.